Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. We are just connecting our streaming feeds and we will get started momentarily. Thank you for joining us. And we are all connected. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Sophia Nehlawi, author events coordinator here at the Enoch Pratt Free Library. Thank you for joining us for the first Lunch and Learn of 2023, Maryland's Jews and Military Service, in partnership with the Maryland State Archives and the Maryland Four Centuries Project. And so now, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to today's speaker, Bert Krumero, who will introduce today's speaker. He is the founding director of the Maryland Four Centuries Project. So, Bert.
Thanks, Sophia, and Happy New Year, and welcome everyone to the first Lunch and Learn lecture in our 2023 season. Thanks as always to our partners, the Maryland State Archives and the Enoch Pratt Free Library. It is the oldest library in the country, open to everyone. My organization, the Maryland's Four Centuries Project, or it's called Maryland 400 too, is dedicated to bringing Maryland's fascinating history to as many Marylanders as possible. The upcoming anniversaries, US 250 in 2026, Baltimore 300 in 2029, and Maryland 400 in 2034, will provide an excellent opportunity to include serious history in the anniversary programs. Our Border States Past has a lot to tell us that still resonates today. Today's speaker, Owen Lowry, a research archivist at the Maryland State Archives, understands how the stories of individuals illuminate the broad historical approach of large-scale events, movements, and eras. Today's historians find great value in researching individuals and their families. The Jewish community in Baltimore has been important and influential since the 18th century. Much of the early Baltimore collection of decorative arts on display in the Maryland Center of History and Culture belonged to successful Jewish families. Their influence led to the 1826 state legislation called the Jew Bill, a significant first for Maryland in America, and it gave Jews the same civil rights as Christians. That story gets most interesting when you meet the two gentlemen, Solomon Edding and Jacob Cohen, who not only got the bill passed, but then got elected to the Baltimore City Council. Then there's Mendes Cohen. He's a one-of-a-kind world traveler who attended Queen Victoria's coronation representing Maryland in full military regalia. And since Maryland 400 is always looking for Maryland firsts, Cohen was the first Marylander who sailed up the Nile flying a Maryland flag. When Jewish immigrants started arriving from Europe in significant numbers in the 1840s and 50s, they faced the dilemma of not only practicing their conservative faith, but also pinning their allegiance to either the North or the South in a divided city. You can visit the excellent Jewish Museum of Maryland in East Baltimore to find the individual stories of that era. Today, you're going to meet Elias Pollock, a Jewish Revolutionary War veteran. Owen Lowry found him as he did his groundbreaking research on the social history of the Maryland 400, the Maryland troops who saved Washington's army on Long Island in 1776, and then went on to become the Maryland Line, arguably the best troops General Washington had available throughout the war. While most of our experience about the Revolution is from 20,000 feet, Owen has brought the war into the gut-wrenching reality that the individual private Yankee Doodles faced for 8 long years. I'm looking forward to meeting Elias Pollock, one of those unsung heroes. I'm also very interested in what he and his family faced as Jews in early Baltimore. Please welcome Owen Lowry.
Well, Bert, thank you so much for that lovely introduction, and Sophia and to the Pratt for organizing all of this. I love the opportunity to tell these stories that I have found over the years. I love the opportunity to tell them to as many people as I can. Um, and these lunch and learn programs that the Pratt is helping put together is these are so wonderful, and it's a really nice opportunity. When you look down the schedule, there's such a nice variety of stories being told, and so I'm glad that I can be a part of that. So we're here today to talk about Elias Pollock. Who is Elias Pollock? Elias Pollock lived in Baltimore from the 1780s until the 1820s. He was one of the few known Jewish Revolutionary War soldiers from the state of Maryland. He prospered in the city in business for many years until his son-in-law's bad investments drove him and his family into bankruptcy. There are no images of Elias Pollock. The guy who's standing right here looking at you, he says, just a stock photo or a stock drawing. We don't know where Elias Pollock was born, who his parents were, and we don't know when he arrived in Maryland, or even if he was born in America. That's not terribly unusual when we look at the first wave, the first generations of Jewish settlers in Baltimore. We know that there are at least a handful of Jews living in the city in the decades before the American Revolution. The population there in Pollock's days was never very large, never more than a dozen or two families in the city. There was no permanent religious congregation there in Elias Pollock's days. There was no Jewish neighborhood in the city. And it can be hard to uncover who all of these Jews were. With some of the families that Bert was mentioning, the Eddings and the Cohens, as well as some of the people they're related to, the Solomons and the Gratzes, they're pretty easy to identify. But it's who all the rest of them were. We know, for example, that there were, even though there was no permanent congregation, we know that there were sporadic services held in the city, that there were privately organized high holiday services from at least the 1780s onward. And while you can imagine of who some of these attendees were, some of these prominent names, you have to wonder, it raises the question, who are the rest of them? Some of them quite possibly were people like Elias Pollock. Pollock fits the profile of the typical Jewish resident of Baltimore in the late 18th century and the early 19th century. Much more so than the people who get the attention, the Cohens and the Eddings, who are remarkable and they're very important in the city's development and in the course of the state's history, but they're not typical of the Jews who come through Baltimore. And Pollock really is. He's in business. He, at his height, was doing well, but he was still far from wealthy. He had a history of traveling from city to city along the East Coast, as his fortunes rose and fell. And we know, for example, that he does business in New York in the early 1780s, and that he's in Philadelphia and some other places in Pennsylvania as well. And that's pretty common. We know that Pollock was Jewish because in 1818, he testified in court in support of his application for a federal veterans pension as a Revolutionary War soldier. And the way you got a pension, a federal pension, was you would swear, you give sworn testimony, you'd go to court, and you would describe where you served. And that was the system that was set up because there wasn't really enough paperwork from the veterans to, you can't just file your paperwork with the pension office and get your money. You had to go and you had to tell a story because so many people didn't have paperwork. And when Pollock goes into court to tell his story, and hopefully you can read it, the handwriting on this isn't super wonderful. Instead of giving an oath that he was going to give his testimony by swearing on the evangels of the Almighty God, Pollock took an oath, quote, on the 5 books of Moses, he being a Jew. And it was so unusual, such a surprise to the clerk, that you can kind of see that this part here on the 5 books of Moses has been inserted between the 2 lines, because the clerk hadn't expected to have to write that. It marks Pollock as one of 2 or perhaps 3 known Jewish soldiers from Maryland in the Revolution. Probably one of no more than 100 or two Jewish soldiers in the war total. At least on the American side, there are certainly some Jewish soldiers, at least a handful, who fought on the British side. Among the Hessians, the Jewish or the German mercenaries. And that's out of an estimated Jewish population of somewhere around 1,500 to 2,000 people in America. And it's really hard to come up with firm numbers. Both that 1 to 200 soldiers and the 1,500 to 2,000 total individuals are very rough numbers. And it's because there's no good way to come up with real numbers. I mean, there's not many records to explain how many Jews there were in the country. Most of the Jewish soldiers who we can identify in America were people who served in the militia. Like some of the people who are mentioned here. Serving in the militia during the American Revolution meant that you would be called into duty for maybe a week at a time, a few days, maybe a month or so. Very rarely in active duty. Most of the people in the militia don't see any combat. They do patrol duty at home. In Maryland, they have the militia guarding important industrial sites, so mines, salt storage, iron furnaces, and they do a little bit of fighting along the Chesapeake Bay and up the Potomac River. Among some of those militia soldiers who we know about are the members of the so-called Jew Company, or as was it's described here as the names of the Israelites who served in one company. This is a unit that was raised in Charleston, South Carolina. It served in 1779 and 1780 while the British were attacking were preparing to attack that city. Sometimes in the history, it's described as being an all-Jewish company, which is pretty far from the truth. There's somewhere between 24, maybe 35 total Jewish soldiers, which is less than half of the total. But it is easily the highest concentration of Jewish soldiers in one unit in the Revolution, and I would venture to guess in any war for quite some time after that. Charleston is different. Charleston has a very large and well-established Jewish population, which had been in the city for many decades before the Revolution. Maryland is very different. There's only, besides Elias Pollock, we know of only one other soldier who we can solidly say was Jewish. It was a man named Nathan Levy, or Nathaniel Levy, who served in a voluntary cavalry unit, the Baltimore Light Horse, in 1780 and 1781. And the Light Horse, they were all volunteers. It was a pretty casual unit. They could come or they could go. They weren't bound to a 3-year enlistment the way an infantry soldier like Elias Pollock was. And it was a unit. It was a cavalry unit. All cavalry units were the province of wealthy young gentlemen. You had to buy all of your own equipment and supply your own horse. And you can see from this photograph, the equipment that they were providing for themselves was extensive and elaborate. This particular unit served mostly in Baltimore, riding around town and going to parades and probably harassing Tories a little bit. In the summer of 1781, they served with the French. They traveled with the French army as it passed through Maryland on its way to Virginia to attack Cornwallis. So they traveled with them through Virginia. They may have seen a little combat, but probably they mostly socialized with the French officers. Elias Pollock's service is very different from that. He served in a line infantry unit in the regular army, so he was paid, unlike militia soldiers who were volunteers. Pollock was paid for a hefty 3-year enlistment, during which time most soldiers aren't getting home at all, or maybe for a short furlough if they have the opportunity. And we know that Pollock, from the time Pollock leaves Maryland in 1778, he doesn't visit through here again until 1781 when he gets out of the army. There is one other soldier from Maryland who is Jewish who may have served, named Reuben Edding. His name comes up if you study the subject at all. His name comes up. There's really no evidence that he did serve, and he is definitely not the same Reuben Edding who was later influential in Maryland politics. And we know that for certain because Reuben Edding and some of his relatives talked about Edding's service and how he'd been involved trying to help establish Jews in the founding of America. And if he had served in the army during the Revolution, they would have mentioned that. It's possible that there were other Jewish soldiers from Maryland. When I was doing this research, I went through lists of soldiers, both in the regular army and in the militia, looking for people whose last names kind of mark them as potentially being Jewish. People named Levy or Solomon or Cohen or Lyons or names like that. And there are some names which jump out at you as being possibilities, but there's nothing that you can compare them to. When you compare them to lists of known Jews in Maryland and Jews on the East Coast, nothing comes up. And it's just such a struggle finding any way to identify Jewish residents of Maryland. There's no places to look. I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on. It's possible that there were other Jewish soldiers in the Revolution for Maryland beyond Pollock, but there were never going to be very many more than him. So let's talk about Elias Pollock's service and what he did. Pollock served in the 3rd Maryland Regiment. He enlisted in June of 1778. When he enlisted, he was issued 2 uniform shirts, which is what's being recorded on this document here. He also received a $40, was supposed to receive a $40 enlistment bonus. The summer of 1778 was a particularly low moment for the Americans during the Revolutionary War. The previous 2 years were a string of battlefield losses, interrupted by only a few victories at Trenton and Princeton in the winter of 1776-77, and at Saratoga in October 1777. The real low point comes in September of that year when the British captured Philadelphia, scattering the American government. Congress was forced to meet in York, Pennsylvania. Now, those of you who are looking on a screen big enough to read the document will notice that this is a group of soldiers whose names start with S, and that the gentleman whose name is highlighted here is Joseph Smith. And that is because Elias Pollock enlisted under the name Joseph Smith, which was a name as generic then as it is now. We don't know exactly why he did that. He doesn't tell us. When he goes in to give his deposition for his pension, Pollock says very matter-of-factly that he enlisted under the name Elias Pollock, and he produces a witness someone he'd served with in the army, who testifies, yes, this man is Elias Pollock, but he served in the army with me under the name Joseph Smith. And that's just kind of accepted as enough explanation, which is too bad, because it would really be nice to know why. It is not likely that he did so because he needed to disguise his ethnic identity or to his religious identity. It's not likely he was doing it to protect the fact that he was Jewish. It's more likely that for one reason or another, someone named Elias Pollock wasn't going to get into the army. He could have been a servant, either an indentured servant. He was only 23. He could have been a convict servant. We know that there are a number of convict servants who are Jewish who get sent to Maryland before the Revolution. Or it could simply be that Elias Pollock, for one reason or another, needed to leave town, and enlisting in the army under an assumed name was a really good way to do that. A few weeks after he enlists, the British actually withdrew from Philadelphia, having decided that the city wasn't worth the effort that was required to hold it. And they head back to New York. They fight briefly at the Battle of Monmouth, which is memorialized in Hamilton, if you are familiar with that. It's where Charles Lee covers himself in glory. Pollock and his comrades get to Philadelphia thus a few weeks later, not long after the British had evacuated the city, where they join the rest of the Maryland line. So Pollock comes up with a group of new recruits, and they join the rest of the Maryland soldiers, part of the Continental Army. And these are, as Bert alluded to in the introduction, this is a contingent of well-trained, battle-hardened veterans, many of whom had been in the service since the very beginning of the war. Pollock and the Marylanders, indeed the whole Continental Army, saw very little action, very little combat over the next 2 years. Pollock says that he spent the rest of 1778 in Philadelphia patrolling and training, as well as building a series of forts along the Hudson River north of New York City. Pollock did see some combat in 1779. He reported that he was part of the Battle of Stony Point in that summer, which would mark him as being a member of the elite Corps of Light Infantry, so a well-regarded soldier. The Battle of Stony Point was a nighttime assault on a British fort along the Hudson, which was done with bayonets. They brought no ammunition because they didn't want to give up the element of surprise. It was a glorious American victory. The next year, or sort of as 1779 winds down, the British come to realize that they're in a stalemate in the North. This fighting in Pennsylvania and New Jersey and New York isn't getting anywhere. And so they shift their action to the South, and into South Carolina. And they set their sights on Charleston, which is on the coast. Charleston and the rest of the Carolinas and in Georgia had large loyalist populations. And the British thought that they could sail away from the main American army, go to this area where people are going to be more supportive of the British cause, and they can actually make some headway. To counter this threat, to counter this new British army that's been sent to the South, the Americans send a large army, including all of the soldiers from Maryland, including Elias Pollock. And they head out from Pennsylvania in the spring of 1780. They travel mostly on foot for 1,000 miles there for a march that they are ill prepared for. They don't all have shoes. They don't have enough food. This is a quote from soldier from the Delaware regiment, which is traveling with the Marylanders through the whole war. As they get into North Carolina, he complains, "At this time, we were much distressed for want of provisions. We were 14 days and drew but 1/2 pound of flour. Some days we drew a 1/2 pound of beef per man, and that was so miserably poor that scarce any mortal could make use of it." They were living chiefly on green apples and peaches, and there are some accounts from soldiers about how they ate crops from the fields they were walking past, which made them sick. You eat corn that's not ready to eat, that's not been cooked, that's not ripe yet. So by the time they get to South Carolina, where the British are, they're all sick, and they're all worn out because they've marched for 4 months. And yet, almost immediately, they find themselves face to face with the British at the Battle of Camden in South Carolina. This was in August of 1780. The Battle of Camden is an absolute disaster for the Americans. Most of the Americans run away during the battle, leaving the Marylanders stuck on the battlefield to take on the British by themselves. The Maryland line loses about a third of its strength, some 600 men either killed or captured. What you can see here is the Marylanders being defeated, and the general who was commanding them, Johann de Kalb, a beloved commander, was killed during the battle. So the Kalb is painted here. The Kalb is also immortalized in a statue on the grounds of the Maryland State House, if you've ever seen him and wondered what this German was doing there. Pollock's regiment, the 3rd, lost the most soldiers of any Maryland unit. They lost 113 out of their roughly 300 soldiers. And Pollock himself was among them. He was wounded in the fighting. He was in the side by a British bayonet wound. He was taken prisoner. He was held, he recalled, first in Charleston, South Carolina, and then eventually sent first to St. Augustine in Florida, where the British had a very large military presence, and then to Halifax in Nova Scotia, which was also a very large British military facility. He was eventually released. He was exchanged in a prisoner exchange, and we don't know the details, but he was back in Annapolis by August of 1781, where he was discharged. His enlistment had expired while he was in captivity, and you can see this was the discharge paper that he received, signed by William Smallwood, legendary Maryland military commander. It too is in the name of Joseph Smith. Pollock, we don't know exactly what he does for the next few years. He's probably in Maryland at least part of the time because he's receiving a pension. Maryland sets up a pension system for wounded soldiers. Not very much money. The amount he's receiving here is only £2 and 10 shillings per month. in 1784 or 1785, which isn't really enough money for anything. But the state didn't really want to pay out pensions to anybody. He may have been traveling around the country a bit. We know he does some business in New York City in this time, where he gets out of town while there's a lawsuit. After a lawsuit gets filed against him, he may be in Philadelphia as well. But he's certainly in Baltimore by 1786. And a few years later, he receives a license as a peddler. But from there, he develops rapidly. He grows his business rather successfully over the next few years. He purchases a house in Old Town, which is this area. So this is Baltimore in 1801. In Old Town, if you can see my mouse, is this area here on the east side of the Jones Falls, sort of in this section. As you can see, it says Old Town right here. Pollock lived on Front Street. So this is a view of Baltimore. It's an incredibly detailed map. This is from 1869, so long after Pollock's time. He'd been out of the city for almost 50 years by that time, but the area hadn't changed appreciably since then. So Pollock lived on Front Street, which is right here, and he lived in one of the houses right along where the street curves. So he lives in one of these houses right over in there on that side of the street. It's a really lovely image. It's amazing to be able to see it. Most of that part of town, certainly that area of Front Street, was redeveloped in the middle of the 20th century, and none of the old properties are there. Within a few years of this, so around this time, Pollock is establishing himself. He goes into business as a manufacturer and retailer of a variety of products, which we don't really have anymore. Black ball, heel ball, wash ball. Wash ball is a kind of soap. If I understand correctly, it was more for cleaning your clothes rather than cleaning yourself. Black ball and heel ball were shoe polishes, but again, they were for used on the manufacturing side to prepare shoes for sale, rather than something that you would use yourself to shine up your shoes. Pollock, in this period, was married. He was married for the first time probably in the 1780s. We don't have a record of it. We don't know his wife's name at all. All we know is that she dies in August of 1802. She and Pollock had two children, Hester and Charlotte, who must have been pretty young at the time that she died. Pollock married again, probably fairly soon, to his second wife named Polly Pollock. Again, all we know about her is that she died in the beginning of 1806, and that she was buried in Baltimore City. She was buried there. She's one of the few known burials in the Jewish cemetery in Baltimore City. The cemetery is the only real Jewish institution in Baltimore at that time. The community, so it's small with perhaps 24 families, which is not enough to support any kind of permanent institutions. There's no congregation, there's no Jewish benevolent society, there's no permanent clergy in town. If you needed to get married, you wanted a rabbi, you could go out of town. Philadelphia is only a few days away, or you could get one to come in from elsewhere, which is what Pollock does when he gets married. And when his children get married, they have a rabbi come from out of town. Or you could get married. There's no civil marriage in Maryland, but you could get married by a Christian minister. And there are certainly some examples of Jews in Maryland who do that. If you needed to get married in a hurry, or you didn't have the money, or you didn't have the connections to secure a rabbi from out of town. Getting a rabbi from Philadelphia certainly would not have been a cheap prospect. And many of the Jews in Maryland were kind of scraping by. The cemetery is the only institution that exists in Maryland or in Baltimore during Pollock's time. It no longer exists. It was located on Monument Street at Greenmount Avenue. When you think about it, a burial is the only thing you can't do out of town. You can get married in Philadelphia, but you have to get married in where you live. And the cemetery no longer exists. There are only a few burials there are only a few people we know who were buried there. It's pretty fortunate that we know that one of Pollock's wives was there. Beginning in the 1820s, 30s, 40s, as more Jewish immigrants arrive in Baltimore, there is a Jewish neighborhood which begins to coalesce in Fells Point. But in Pollock's time, there are so few Jews and they're so widely scattered that that's not true. Some of the more prominent members of the Jewish community, the richer folks, lived in the center of town where the fashionable houses were. Pollock lived in Old Town, which actually had a small cluster of Jewish residents. So in addition to Pollock, we know that for a time, Mordecai, who lived in Baltimore since the 1780s, he lives around the corner. And Isaac Mordecai, his son, lives there. And that there's a gentleman named Wolf Pollock who may or may not have been related to Elias. We don't know. But he certainly was Jewish, and he lived in Baltimore for a few years, actually on Front Street, no doubt close to where Elias lived. This period of time, the early 1800s, was a period of political activism among Baltimore's Jews, though they were few in number. The state's constitution from 1776, which was written at the beginning of the American Revolution, required that all office holders take an oath in support of the state, as it says here, but also that they needed to demonstrate a declaration in the belief of the Christian religion, which rules Jews out pretty clearly. Why is this provision there? There's no debate about it. It doesn't come up in any of the discussion. If they talked about it at all, they left no record. There are not many records from the Constitutional Convention. Most of what we have is Charles Carroll of Carrollton complaining about too-much democracy. So nobody explains why. We know that there was some religious tolerance is expressed elsewhere in the Constitution, because it makes provisions for members of religions that didn't allow them to swear oaths. So for Quakers and for Dunkers and other religious groups, they could give an affirmation rather than swearing an oath. There's no particular reason to think that this was specifically aimed at disenfranchising Jews. And I think that's an important point to make. There's certainly casual anti-Semitism in Maryland, as there was anywhere in sort of the British world, or the recently British world. But even that, there's not a long history of that. And it's more likely that that the Jews weren't even considered, that they were sort of an afterthought, or collateral damage, if anything, which I think really captures the position of Jews in Maryland at the beginning of the 19th century, which is so far outside of anyone's scope of what they're thinking about that they could be written out of public life without any discussion. But by the end of the 19th century, Jewish citizens are beginning to push to have this restriction removed, to amend the Constitution. Oops, I'm sorry. That's a picture of a synagogue, which we don't need right now. And it begins in 1797, where a group led by Solomon Edding and others send a petition to the legislature, to the House of Delegates, stating that they are a sect of people called Jews, and they are thereby deprived of the many invaluable rights of citizenships, praying that they be placed on the same footing with other citizens. The House reads it. They later report that this petition is a reasonable one and that it's worth taking up to discuss. But they're not going to do it this year. They're too busy, and there's too much to do in session. The session is less than halfway over, and the session doesn't wrap up until February. But they don't have enough going on, and so they drop it. And the matter stays dropped for another 5 years, until 1802, when a petition from sundry inhabitants of the city of Baltimore, praying that a law may pass enabling the sect of people called Jews to hold and enjoy any office, is sent. And this time, the House actually takes it up, and they write a bill, and they vote on it. And it loses 17-38 in the House, although both of Baltimore's delegates vote in favor of it. And then another petition is taken up, is sent in 1803, and the House takes no action on it. And the whole matter sits for another almost 20 years. Was Pollock among those sundry inhabitants of Baltimore? We don't know. The petitions themselves have not survived. But there's some reason to believe that he could have been, or at least that he supported their goals. And it's not because we know that he harbored dreams of holding political office necessarily, but because he was carrying out his own quiet campaign of political activism during these years. In 1803, Elias Pollock bought a tavern. He bought on the road leading out of Baltimore towards Washington, D.C., apparently trying to diversify his business interests. And when he signed the deed, which is what his signature is right here, he signed it in Hebrew. Or rather, he signed it in Hebrew characters, transliterating it phonetically as Elias Pollock. So Elias Pollock, not using a Hebrew equivalent of the name, not like Eliyahu or something like that. And he did it again when he signed on the mortgage for the property on his house on Front Street. And when he sold the tavern. In all, he signs 5 times on deeds in Hebrew. And this is really strange. This is really unusual. To understand how unusual this is, let's back up, take a quick detour, and talk about record-keeping practices. What happens when you record a deed in the 19th century? And the process really isn't that different from what it is now. Now you file it on a computer, but in the old days, you'd go together, you meet the person you were going to exchange property with, and you'd sign the paper. That was your deed. But that deed wasn't really important until you brought it to the county courthouse and had it recorded, had it transcribed by hand into a large record volume. And that's where this signature is. It's not on the original manuscript deed paper. It's in the record books. Did Pollock himself sign it? Almost certainly not. The handwriting from deeds, between the different deeds, it varies pretty widely. In one of the deeds, his name is spelled wrong one of the times. So it was probably signed by one of the assistant clerks in the courthouse. But why? Why would they do that? And how did Pollock arrange for this? It wasn't when you brought your deed in to have it recorded. They didn't copy it for you and give it and do that on the same day. There wasn't same day service. It takes a long time to copy a deed by hand. And Baltimore in the early 19th century is growing so rapidly, so tremendously, that there are so many deeds. The clerk's office probably had a pretty substantial backlog. So they weren't doing this at the time, while Pollock was there watching them necessarily, when he brought the deed to file it. Maybe the clerks were doing it because they were bored, because of the novelty of it. Perhaps this was Pollock simply had a particularly forceful personality, or he was able to convince them or to work a connection. But whatever the reason was, or however he managed to do it, it clearly was pretty important to him, because whatever the steps were that he did to accomplish this, it wasn't a simple thing. And this is something that definitely mattered to him. And the details of why may be lost to time, but he must have been motivated in some way to do so, to assert his Jewish identity, to ensure the fact that he was Jewish was not left unknown. And, very few people were ever going to see that his name was signed in Hebrew on these deeds. But I think that actually makes some of the significance actually increases, because it was done as a matter of principle to him. And doing so, proclaiming himself so publicly to be Jewish at a time where the legislature is debating whether Jews have the right to hold public office is an inherently political act. And I think that's really important to think about. It widens the scope of when we talk about who is lobbying for political rights for Maryland's Jews. It's not simply the people who go to the legislature and petition, or the people who are lobbying. It's everyone. It's anyone who is there willing to identify themselves as being Jewish. Elias Pollock is very much one of them. So let's catch up with Elias. What else is he doing in this period of time? So here's the family tree. It's very busy. Pollock had a very busy personal life. He was married 3 times. So Elias Pollock is here. His first wife, whose name is unknown, who we met earlier, with whom he has Hester Pollock, and Charlotte. His second wife, Polly, who dies in 1806. And so she dies in February 1806. He remarries again for a 3rd time in August 1806 to Rebecca Hart. And she is the only one of his wives who we know very much about. She was from Philadelphia, where she came from a very prominent family. She was about a dozen years younger than he was. And her family had been active. They'd been first in Easton, Pennsylvania, and then in Philadelphia. Within a couple of years, Rebecca and Elias have two daughters. First Rachel in 1809, and then Matilda in 1811. In the years that his third and fourth daughters are being born, Elias's older children are getting married. Hester marries Isaac Jacob Levy from Philadelphia, who goes on to be a very prominent member of Philadelphia society and a leader within the Jewish community there. Charlotte marries in 1809, I believe. I don't have the date written down here. Yes, right there on the family tree. She marries a man named Isaac Cook, who actually comes and settles in Baltimore with Charlotte. Elias Cook is the one who brings about Elias Pollock's downfall. Isaac, you can see him listed in the city directory right here, was a clarifier of quills. So he prepared quills and sold them to be used as pens. He and Charlotte live on Front Street, not very far away from where Elias and the rest of the family are living, in a house that they rent there. They apparently were living quite well. Perhaps clarifying quills was a pretty good business. From tax assessment records, we know that Isaac and Charlotte own a really significant amount of silver plates, so silverware, silver serving dishes, things like that. But between 1812, 1813, when Isaac moves to Baltimore, and 1816, he takes on a really large amount of debt to a series of grocers and to dry good dealers. $3,700 to one firm alone, which $3,700 in 1815 is a tremendous amount of money. Exactly what he's doing is unclear. Some sort of investments, no doubt. And in the course of taking on these debts, Elias signs on the promissory notes for Isaac as a co-signer. And we know that because in 1816, as the debts begin to come due, Isaac abandons his family and he disappears. And that leaves the co-signer, that leaves Elias Pollock liable for all of these debts. And they go to court, and the court cases run for years. It takes 5 years for them to work their way through. So these are the court dockets for two of the cases. There's a third case, which is not shown on here. It's listed, Elias Pollock, the garnishee of Isaac Cook. We don't know exactly what's happening in the cases because the court dockets are almost the only court records that have survived from Baltimore, from the courts. There were undoubtedly a great many filings of papers and claims. We know that in at least one of them, there are significant number of depositions which are taken, which would be just fascinating to be able to read and find out what's happening. Sadly, those are long gone. But when you untangle all of the web of these complicated court cases, the end result is not much of a surprise. It's exactly what it was always going to be, which is that Pollock's and the family's property is seized and sold at auction. Sold in June of 1821. The family's house, the workshop on Front Street, which is all held at one property, is seized and stolen and sold. Within a week or two, Pollock declares insolvency, and they move out of town. Now, during all of this, as the courts work their way through the court system, or as the cases work their way through the court system, Elias applies for federal veterans pension in 1818, so about halfway through, which he receives his pension. He gets $8 a month, which is what a private was entitled to. It's not a lot of money, even in 1818, $8 a month, or 1819 when he finally gets it. It was not a lot of money. But it would have been something and would have no doubt helped supplement the family's income. In 1820, he gets thrown off the pension rolls with everybody. the federal government declares that anyone who had a pension has to reapply. They were trying to cut down on fraud and trying to cut down on the number of people they were paying. And he reapplies in 1821, in June of 1821, just less than 2 weeks after his family's house has been sold at auction. And here's that application. Again, very hard to read, so I'll read this for you. My property consists, he wrote. So one of the things that the veterans had to do is they had to demonstrate financial necessity. And this is not a challenge for Elias Pollock. My property consists of 2 common tables, 1 old desk, some chairs, some trifling articles of crockery and kitchen furniture, the whole worth, say, $20. And to give a little context and to give some insight into how far Pollock's fortunes had fallen, at some point there's a record of them selling a set of chairs that the family had owned. And the chairs alone were worth $20. My family consists of a wife named Rebecca, aged about 53 years, now nearly helpless, 2 daughters under the age of 12, and there are also dependent on me a daughter, that's Charlotte, and her 2 infant children, who were deserted by the husband and father. I formerly manufactured black balls on an industrial scale, by which that and some other small trade supported myself and family with a comfortable home. But in consequence of becoming a bondsman to another, you can see he has it underlined in the text over here, bondsman, he's just livid about this. I have had my house, my furniture, my property of every kind seized and sold, leaving me in such a state of penury as to be absolutely unable to support myself or my family without the benefit of my revolutionary pension. I labor under severe affliction of a rupture, it's a hernia, occasioned by the hardships experienced while in the Army of the United States, and from a bayonet wound received at the Battle of Camden. And again, you can see down at the bottom, he signs his name in Hebrew. And in this instance, it's almost certainly Pollock's own handwriting. By the time he begins to receive this pension, which he's granted the pension, he begins to receive it. By that time, the family is living in Philadelphia. Presumably, they're living with family. Elias's daughter Hester is living there, and so is Rebecca's family. And Elias had done business with some of Rebecca's brothers, so there were a lot of connections there, and they were presumably calling on family for support. Elias receives his pension, his $8 a month, which again is not a lot of money, but would have been probably at this point, he's in his 60s, probably his only real source of steady income. He receives that until his death on May 10th, 1832. Rebecca lives in Philadelphia until she dies in 1836. Both of them were buried at the Spruce Street Cemetery in Philadelphia, where members of the city's Jewish community had been buried for years. When we think about Elias Pollock, when we think about what is the significance of all of this, what is Pollock's legacy in Maryland history? Most of the history of Maryland's Jewish community, and particularly the history of this early period, from the Revolution into the beginning of the 19th century, is told through the experience of prominent families like the Cohens and the Eddings, who were wealthy, they were well connected, they had lived in Baltimore for a long time, and as Bert mentioned, all of these families leave behind extensive records of personal papers. Some at the Maryland Center of History and Culture, some at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, and other institutions. And it's indisputable that these families played really significant roles in shaping Maryland history, both within the Jewish community and in the state at large. But people like Elias Pollock are far more representative of what that Jewish community looks like. Last week was the 197th anniversary of the passage of the Jew Bill in January of 1826. And that's what an image of here. This is the manuscript version of the law. Careful listeners will note that I just said it passed in January 1826, and this one is dated 1824. And that's because to be a constitutional amendment, it had to be passed twice in successive years. So once in January 1825, and then once again in 1826. The figure most prominently associated with the passage of the Jew Bill the Jew bill, as they called it, was Thomas Kennedy, who was a member of the House of Delegates from Washington County. Kennedy was not Jewish. Kennedy, in a speech, mentioned that he didn't even know any Jews before he started pushing for the bill's passage. And Kennedy, let's be fair, and Kennedy champions this bill for years. He loses his seat in the House for a time, and he is subjected to some really pretty deplorable rhetoric from people who are opposing him. Some really terrible anti-Semitic things are said about him and about the Jewish community in Maryland. And it's Kennedy, along with a few other names, so Jacob I. Cohen, Solomon Edding's uncle Levi Solomon, who lobbied the legislature, and Edding and Solomon published a lengthy piece in the Baltimore newspapers advocating for the passage of this bill and talking about all the things that Jews had done in Maryland and had done during the founding of the United States to help put Jews into the founding of America. And Cohen and Edding were elected to the Baltimore City Council in 1826, that very year, the first two Jewish office holders in Maryland. But the truth is that it wasn't simply their advocacy that brought about the passage of this amendment. It was the growing economic and the political clout of all of Baltimore's Jews, of the whole community, that led to this law's passage. Elias Pollock was out of the city. He had been gone for a couple of years by the time this passes. But nevertheless, part of the power from that community flows from him, since he had helped build that community, that business community, and helped build that religious community, even though he is not listed among one of the bill's advocates. It's easy to look at Elias Pollock's life as being a story of difference, that as a Jew, he is part of a tiny minority within Baltimore and within the United States at large. In the Continental Army, he was part of an even smaller number of Jews. It is more than likely that he went through his entire time in the Army without meeting another Jew in service. But his religion was really important to him, which is what was demonstrated by his signing his name in Hebrew to legal documents. And it's by signing his name in legal documents that we actually, it's really one of the only ways that we can identify him as being somebody from Maryland who is Jewish and being a Jewish soldier. He did it for one reason or another because he wanted to be remembered that he was Jewish, and through his actions, he succeeded. And when we think about Pollock, we should remember that he's not just telling the story of an exceptional individual, somebody who signs his documents in Hebrew, who was one of two Jewish soldiers from Maryland, because he actually had a great deal in common with thousands of other people from Maryland and from across the countries. That he's a veteran of the Revolutionary War, one who suffered pretty badly as a result of his service. He's somebody whose economic fortunes, for a time, he did very well in America, and then for a time he did very badly as his economic situation crumbled. And that's also pretty common among people in the United States in those years. And it is ultimately, remember, it's his family and it's also his military service that provides him with a measure of financial comfort, of salvation over those final years. And then finally, one way to think about what Pollock's legacy is that his memory was kept alive, not just by him signing his name in Hebrew, but also because two of his daughters named children Elias P. after their grandfather. Thank you all so much for tuning in today. I will stick around to answer a few questions. My contact information, if you want to get in touch with me, is right here. Is my email address, as well as the website for our Revolutionary War research on Maryland soldiers. And one final note: the picture here, the photograph, is of the Spruce Street Cemetery in Philadelphia, the old section of the Jewish cemetery there. And the grave right there in the front with the American flag on it is where Chaim Solomon was buried. Solomon was a wealthy merchant in Philadelphia during the years of the American Revolution, sometimes called the financier of the American Revolution. He, as the war ground on in the United States, government ran out of money. Solomon, both from his business and from his personal accounts, made some pretty significant loans to help support the American Revolution. There, thank you so much. I'll be happy to answer any questions if we have some.
We do. So we have a couple questions, and we've got around 5 minutes before 12, so I think I can get them in. Is it possible to, this one's from Facebook, is it possible to view online full scans of the maps shown?
Absolutely, they certainly are. The map, so the Saxe bird's eye is all online from the Library of Congress. And if you just type in Saxe bird's eye, Baltimore City, you should be able to find it. It should come right up. The other map is online through the State Archives website, which is a little bit harder to describe how to find. We have that one kind of buried a little bit. But if you send either an email to me or to the Archives help desk, and our help desk email is on the front page of the Archives website, someone can help point you towards that.
Awesome. Okay. We had a question in from Twitter, so I'm going to read that one aloud. What kind of time and resources went into researching Elias Pollock, especially with not everything surviving history from then till now?
Absolutely, a terrific question. So I spent, I started studying Elias Pollock, well, before the pandemic at the very least. So the photograph here of the cemetery I took when I was in Philadelphia, doing some research. I did that in February, late February 2020. So in hindsight, really dodged a bullet with that. So the resources that were brought on, that were involved in pulling this together, the Revolutionary War pension, his veteran's pension, and those pension applications are available online. They are a tremendous resource. Not all of them have as much detail as Pollock's does, but others do. A lot of information that I found about him was published in the newspaper. And again, you can find historic newspapers online through a number of databases. And that's really wonderful. I mean, when I started working at the State Archives, there were hardly any online databases. And if you wanted to find something in an old newspaper, you were kind of blindly poking through microfilm. So there's a lot of newspaper stories, some advertisements, the notes about his marriages and his children's marriages were ran in the newspaper. There are the court records, of course. Those are the original court records are held at the Maryland State Archives. There are census records that went into this. And there are also some correspondence and some family records, which I located at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, which is in Philadelphia. And that's records not from Pollock's family himself, but from business that he was doing with some of his wife, from some of the Harts and some of the related families there as well.
All right. We've got time for two more. So I'm going to read them now. Was Elias Pollock related to the wealthy Isaac Pollock of Georgetown, a contemporary?
I am not certain about that. That is a fair question. There are a number of other people named Pollock who show up in these sort of compilations of known Jewish residents of Maryland and of the United States. It includes Wolf Pollock, who I mentioned earlier, who lives in Maryland, who lives around the corner from Pollock, from Elias for a time. And we don't know. He may have been, they could have been brothers, they could have been cousins, they could have been completely unrelated. But we don't know anything about Elias Pollock. The first time his name shows up on anything is in the summer of 1778 when he enlists in the army. And he doesn't even call himself Elias Pollock then.
All right. And our last question was Solomon Levy, a Jew from Baltimore who was the second graduate of the U.S. Military Academy, of similar middling economic status?
I can't say for certain, so don't hold me to any of this. My instinct would be to say no, that the Levy family, there is a very prominent Levy family in Baltimore. One of the people I mentioned advocating for the passage of the Jew bill was Solomon Levy, who's presumably related to that Solomon. That Solomon Levy who was lobbying for the Jew bill was pretty wealthy and well connected. So my guess would be that they're of a higher economic status, but I can't say that for certain because I'm not sure.
All right. And with that, it is 2 p.m. So I want to thank Owen for today's presentation. A wonderful, informative kickoff to our Lunch and Learn series for this year. So thank you, Owen. I want to thank our partners at the Maryland State Archives and the Maryland 4 Centuries Project for bringing us Lunch and Learn programming for the next year. And to the Hearing and Speech Agency for providing accessibility for today's program. And then last but certainly not least, thank you everyone in our audience for joining us this afternoon. Our next Lunch and Learn program is going to be in February 9th at 1 p.m. like always. So with that, thank you everyone. Stay safe and take care.
Thank you so much.